Welcome back to Everything is Ideology. I'm your host, Dr. Lee Kaplan. In this episode, we're diving into a history that feels uncannily familiar, one where media, persuasion, and strategic communication shape public opinion in ways that still resonate today. I'm joined by Stuart Anderson-Davis, a doctoral researcher at Columbia University studying the history of deception and disinformation. We discuss his article, False Friends, Quakers, Fronts, and the Rise of Popular Abolitionism. Our conversation centers on a group that often sits at the margins of this history, the Quakers. While they're frequently remembered for their moral opposition to slavery, what emerges here is something far more complex. We unpack how Quaker activists navigated suspicion, marginalization, and political exclusion to build one of the earliest anti-slavery sentiments to bolster anti-slavery sentiments and legislation. They did so by creating social movements, experimenting with tactics that feel strikingly contemporary, including media campaigns, narrative framing, anonymous publishing, and even forms of strategic deception. Their abolitionist efforts weren't just moral or religious gestures, they were systematic, coordinated and deeply strategic. At a time when slavery was foundational to global economies and widely accepted as normal, even justified, Quakers were helping to build a counter-public that insisted it was not only wrong, but intolerable. We talk about how they transformed abolition into a movement. This meant organizing some of the first large-scale petition campaigns, lobbying politicians directly, and circulating pamphlets that exposed the realities of the slave trade, especially the violence of the Middle Passage and plantation life. At the heart of this discussion is a tension that still defines activism today. How do you persuade a public that may not want to be persuaded? And what happens when moral arguments collide with entrenched economic and ideological systems? We also explore the contradictions within these movements, the internal divisions among Quakers themselves, the roles of formerly enslaved voices in shifting public persuasion and perception, and the emergence of competing narratives that sought to defend slavery through disinformation and distortion. If you like what we do here, please become a patron at patreon.com/everythingisideology or donate. Give a one-time donation at buymeacoffee.com/everythingisideology. Hello and welcome back to Everything is Ideology. I'm incredibly excited and grateful to be joined by Stuart Anderson-Davis, who's currently studying for a PhD in communications from Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. His academic work is focused on the history of deception and disinformation, a good time to talk about these sorts of things. Anderson-Davis's dissertation examines the ways in which deceptive communications shaped events and influenced public opinion in Britain and the United States during the 18th and 19th centuries. He also writes about politics, media, communications, and disinformation for various publications, including the Columbia Journalism Review. He holds a BA in History and Ancient History from the University of Nottingham and an MPhil in Modern European History from Cambridge University. So thank you so much for joining us here from so far away. I'm grateful for technologies such as Zoom and whatnot, which also probably plays a role in various forms of communication, messaging, information, and disinformation, especially nowadays. So I had a great time going through your piece and reading it. I thought it was incredibly interesting to think about these early movements in which people are using sort of political forms of communication and things that become normalized over time, such as like lobbying, and having different like collectives and thinking through like who the person in charge is and stuff like this. Like the civil rights play
Mm.
does a lot of this stuff as well, you know. So it's really interesting to see an early instantiation of this sort of stuff. But not too many people sort of know about the Quakers and their efforts, and you seem to be kind of rectifying
Mm.
that in many different ways, as you kind of make clear throughout the article. So can you first maybe give us an overview of sort of who the Quakers were, the role they played in society, and also I guess we can, if you want to say something about the different sort of contexts that were happening, because the Society of Friends functioned differently in both the American scene or like really the British colonial scene in the New World, um, or you know, New World or whatever, um, and
Mhm.
Britain, because they had different reputations.
They did, sure. Well, thank you very much for having me on. I think there's possibly uh, no one more surprised than me to be talking about Quakers on a podcast at the moment. That's definitely not the sort of thing I imagined I would be doing when I started out with my kind of my research. So to bring it back to how I kind of found the Quakers in the first place, or rather the kind of the role of Quakers, I think in this particular story, um, Quakers were so kind of a religious sect formed in Britain, in England, in the sort of mid 17th century by a man called George Fox. Um, Chiefly, the kind of the role in terms of America is when a man called William Penn moves across to called the New World to America, establishes the colony of Pennsylvania. The group in Britain, one of the reasons why people like Penn and other Quakers were kind of moving across is that the group faced kind of quite extensive persecution. Initially in the early years, they were kind of dissenters. They were people who were not kind of going with the flow with the kind of the Anglican established church. And one of the reasons why is they had kind of quite radical different views on various different subjects, whether that's the kind of relationship between the individual and God, but also other areas that have kind of become, I guess, they were sort of ahead of their time, and from kind of women's rights and the role of women in the church through to kind of slavery, enslavement, and the slave trade. So Quakers do have a really kind of central role in the story of kind of abolition. But it's one that's sort of often been kind of underplayed, or at various different times it gets emphasized, and at other times it kind of gets forgotten about, depending on the perspective. Um, so by the time we kind of the paper that I kind of, well, period that I look at is very much sort of 1780s. By this point, kind of Quakers in Britain, relations have kind of stabilized to some extent between the state, the kind of established elites, and the kind of the Quakers. They're no longer being kind of imprisoned. It's no longer a crime to be a Quaker. However, there is various different ways in which they're kind of outsiders. So they're not allowed to serve in particular professions, at the universities, serve in the army. So there's still an element of suspicion and kind of outsiderness. And I think there are other ways as well in which they're kind of othered, I guess, in kind of British society, whether that's kind of satirical plays that are put on, a kind of, Book of Mormon equivalents that are kind of being produced in the sort of 1770s, through to kind of mockery, through to disinformation. And occasionally you will get kind of flare-ups of people kind of pointing suspicion about, what is this kind of insidious influence that they have in British society. But certainly by the 1780s, it's nothing quite as bad as what's happening in America. So Quakers play quite an interesting role in the American Revolution. And they are one of the kind of founding tenets of Quakerism is kind of pacifism. So they refuse to support the kind of the patriot endeavor, the whole uprising, despite quite considerable pressure that is placed on them by various different kind of patriot, whether it's the congressional committees, local societies, committees of safety. All of these are kind of treating the Quakers with increased kind of hostility and suspicion. The idea being that kind of Quakerism and this whole pacifist thing is a bit of an excuse for, helping the British out secretly, passing military secrets to the British, loyalism. So there's a real sense of suspicion about Quakers. There's, they are the subject of disinformation at various different points. There are, leading Quakers are kind of exiled without trial, imprisoned. And even once the kind of the Revolutionary War is over, there is still a sense that kind of Quakers are sort of, it's kind of almost like an enemy within, that they are sort of still loyal to the British, and that they are going to seek to undermine the new kind of republic in any way that they can. So there's different elements kind of go into that, and that ties into the story of kind of abolitionism and anti-slavery activism that plays out in that period of sort of the 1780s, as kind of Britain and the new United States of America are kind of dealing with their new relationship to each other.
So that was a really helpful and insightful kind of story that's being told here. And it seems like it was because of their social position and whatnot, and the various attitudes towards kind of slavery and what abolition might look like. Because abolition was, it seems like, and it was really such a deeply ensconced institution that to question it was to question the very foundations of society. And if that's coming from a group that's already marginalized and suspicionalized for various reasons, that's obviously calls for a different type of activism and activist sort of work, and a different strategy that's innovative to the point where we're using it still in different ways. For instance, like I recently saw Amy Goodman's well, it's called Steal This Story. It's about democracy now, but more or less Amy Goodman plays a large role throughout, right? And independent news journalism and stuff. And she's going up to the movie starts out with her kind of going up to different one specific politician, and just kind of being continually asking him questions and following him. Just like no matter how fast he goes,
Yeah.
he speeds up, she speeds up, you know what I mean? This sort of
We call that doorstepping in the UK. I'm not sure if that's necessarily come across, but yeah, you basically don't leave someone
yeah,
alone.
exactly. And it seems like the Quakers did that sort of thing, much to the chagrin of the American public uh, at the time. At least you sort of it seemed like, or maybe it was, I think it was the American context.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are one of the kind of themes that I get into the paper is this idea of how kind of prominent the Quakers feel like they should be or prepared to be in the kind of anti-slavery campaigns that they're launching. And I think there is a real marked difference between individual activists, particularly in America, who are still, as Quakers, very, very keen to sort of be at the forefront of their campaign. So they are, they're doing lobbying missions to Congress where they're sort of sat in the gallery looking down at kind of congressmen and kind of, intercepting them, to your point, your example, intercepting them in the corridors and saying, handing them pamphlets about enslavement and the conditions of on slave ships. And then you have others who are saying, well, actually, particularly in America, like maybe we're not the right people to be fronting this particular campaign, given the suspicions around us. Actually, maybe it would be better off if we found different messengers who, for whatever reason, are going to be more acceptable both to kind of the politicians who will ultimately make the decisions around kind of, legislation, but also to the general public, who are so much a part of this conversation. The idea that this is an age very much where you feel like if you can get mobilized public support behind a particular cause, you can actually, for the first time, really effectively pressurize politicians and kind of and various different kind of key stakeholders into making kind of positive change. So there is a sense that in some respect Quakers are very well situated to lead a lot of this work. I think one of the kind of the stories of the mid 18th century is the way that kind of the Society of Friends, as the kind of Quakers are formerly known, are kind of able to kind of remove themselves from the kind of the slave-based economy to the extent that it's possible in that period, and they kind of divest themselves from direct interest involved in slavery. So from that perspective, they have an economic advantage to kind of take this moral stance. But in other senses, Quakers, are absolutely not the right spokespeople for this type of campaign. They're already seen as kind of a bit weird, a bit suspicious, and not necessarily the right people to be saying, well, we should be taking a proactive stance on kind of being the first country in the world that will abolish the slave trade, even though we know that this is going to potentially have a negative short-term impact on our economy and is going to potentially play to the advantage of our geopolitical rivals. So there are a few different things going on here, and I think the way that individual Quakers and Quaker institutions choose to respond to this kind of context is really, really important. And I would argue, kind of helps explain why you have some successes in some parts of the world and some parts of Britain and the United States and other ones where campaigns end up kind of almost reverberating back on the Quakers and stirring up some of that hostility and suspicion that the grandees and the institutions want to try and move away from.
Yeah, no, that's great. And it definitely, your answer sort of just pointed to another kind of complication within this social fabric, which is that Quakers, whether they were on one side or the other, sort of Britain or America, both had kind of different internal pressures and whatnot, and different groups and factions and ideas. And there was different splits that you illustrate happening. And these various splits then called for different forms of kind of organization, deception, disinformation, and techniques. I was wondering if you would talk sort of about kind of the intricacy that's happening between their internal correspondence, like sort of the disagreements, disputes they had, why they happened, and then also if you want to dig into some of the personalities involved.
I think that's definitely right. I think there is no such thing as a kind of a unified kind of Quaker position on anti-slavery or kind of campaign strategy at this point. I think there are, as you say, there are various sort of divides that are happening. There's a sort of a geographical division, particularly in the kind of the 1760s, 1770s, where American Quaker institutions such as the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, or individual Quakers such as Anthony Benezet, are very much kind of pushing their British equivalents to be more proactive in terms of campaigning against slavery. So you're getting these various correspondents that are going back and forth across the Atlantic, where Americans are kind of are pushing the British to sort of, for example, use your political capital to launch a new campaign in Parliament calling for the abolition of the slave trade, for example. You also have kind of generational divides, which I'm sure is a theme of kind of activist history anyway, but you have these kind of the younger generation who are kind of pushing back on the orthodoxies of the kind of the older, more established figures who are still running Quaker institutions. In Britain, you have a kind of establishment figure, David Berkeley in particular, who's kind of the grandee of all the grandees of Quakers, obviously now still associated with Barclays Bank. And he's much more conservative. He's kind of described, I think, in some correspondence as a kind of an old hare. And he's much more pushing back on the Americans, saying, this is just going to be risky. This is going to really threaten the happy status quo that we've developed in Britain if we start pushing them to do things they don't want to do. But you have younger generations of kind of activists, the likes of kind of James Phillips and Samuel Hoare, who are kind of saying we shouldn't be doing this. We should be, and they're very much in conversation by letters with Benezet, who's absolutely brilliant at kind of establishing this network of kind of sort of supporters, particularly kind of the next generation of kind of Quaker leaders, and also the kind of after the revolution, the kind of the war heroes as well. The revolution heroes that you want to be making this sort of sending this sort of message out is going to be much more appealing than if it's kind of made by Quakers who are still under suspicion. So you have the kind of the generational divides, you have the geographical divides, you also have a bit of a wealth divide as well. So there's some fantastically wealthy Quakers this period, particularly kind of in America, the likes of kind of Israel Pemberton in Philadelphia. And before the revolution, he's sort of complains about being badgered by Anthony Benezet the whole time, about how rich he is, and how he should be doing more around campaigning against slavery. And you have this sort of sense that for some Quakers, this is a sort of a bit of a pain. It's actually a bit of a threat to the kind of stability and wealth that they've kind of generated. Whereas for others, this is a real calling. One of the tenets of kind of Quakerism is this idea of the golden rule, do to others as you would have them do to you. And so how can you possibly stand by while, hundreds of people are being crammed into slave ships and transported, or being, the sort of brutalities that you're seeing in plantations in kind of the West Indies and in the southern states. And this all kind of comes to a head in the kind of the 1770s and 1780s, where it seems like finally there's kind of a weight of opinion within the kind of the Quaker institutions, even amongst kind of the grandees themselves, that they should be doing more and that they will start to campaign more actively against slavery.
No, that's great. And there's definitely so many contradictions also well, not just ideologically, but like class-based that form into ideological opinions, like you were saying with like Barclay especially. It seems like, there's still a lot of BDS efforts against the Barclays and Barclay Center and whatnot, and all of these sorts of things. So
Yeah.
that contradiction very much lives with us in very many ways.
Yeah, and I think that's just because someone is kind of campaigning against the slave trade, it doesn't necessarily mean that they haven't themselves had a history of kind of slave ownership or involvement in those sorts of businesses. I think David Berkeley is a kind of a classic example of someone who goes on I guess if we were being generous, we'd say goes on a journey from the perspective of he inherits a number of kind of enslaved laborers in a plantation in Jamaica, all the way through to by the end of his life, where he's sort of very much sort of being positioned or slightly positioned himself as this kind of pioneering anti-slavery activist, and he sort of produces this almost go-to book about how to manumit your enslaved workers. So there's a lot of contradictions in here. There's a lot of elements to which Quakers are able to do a lot of this work because of their privileged positions in some ways. And I think one thing perhaps we'll get into later on is the role of kind of enslaved and formerly enslaved activists themselves in kind of pushing this along, and they obviously play a hugely important part in this as well. But I think by the 1780s, you have kind of Quakers who have got the kind of the wealth, connections, and the resources, and potentially the kind of the institutional know-how to build a movement out of kind of a lot of disparate anti-slavery kind of discourse.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad you alluded to that series of sort of questions about the agency of enslaved and formerly enslaved that were happening within this too. Just wanted to point out, there seems to be something about nonviolence happening within the Quakers, and also considering the Quakers' legacy of the ways in which they use public media and public perception and whatnot. That sort of also seems to tie in with like a nonviolence, pacifistic kind of attitude. Um, was there ever any arguments over sort of violence, nonviolence, or kind of like escalatory measures or anything like that in the correspondence as far as we know?
Not that I've seen. In terms of the pacifism is really. I mean, I think it's sort of one of the key kind of tensions in America for the Quakers is particularly around this kind of role of, to what extent do you have a responsibility to get involved in the broader protection? Would you, for example, if you're in a frontier town and you are attacked by another group, whether it's kind of Native American tribes or something, do you have a responsibility to, pick up a gun and involve yourself in the collective defense? And that kind of ties in as well to the kind of the revolution and the idea that, Quakers as people who are living in the colonies must have some responsibility to resist what the patriots are saying is the kind of the forced enslavement of Americans by kind of the British Crown and companies like the East India Company and this type of thing. Certainly haven't seen anything that sort of suggested that kind of Quakers would ever break from that. And so, I mean, you do have disagreements over slavery and over activism, and you have occasionally kind of splinter groups and stuff. And so maybe that would be something a kind of a someone who's much more specialist on kind of Quaker history would be able to tell you. But it's all about the stuff that I'm seeing, or the correspondence and the pamphlets, the newspaper articles. Everything is about persuasion, persuading the public, persuading politicians. In some cases, even attempting to persuade those actually involved in the slave trade and enslave them themselves that this is wrong. And the idea that you can kind of there's maybe a slightly naive sense amongst some of the kind of the Quakers that if you can just tell people what's going on and kind of bring to life these stories and how wicked it is, then that will necessarily lead to change. And that's very much the kind of the position of the much more kind of overt Quaker campaigns in the 1780s, the ones that they're kind of signing themselves, the ones that are, that they're leading in missions into Parliament and to Congress. And that, the idea that if you just saw or just heard about what was going on in these plantations, you would change it. And I think you have a divide where you have other activists who are maybe a bit more cynical and a bit more savvy, who think, well, actually, just to raise awareness of something is not an issue. Slavery has been going on for thousands of years, and it's apparently it's condoned by the Bible. You can make an economic case for slavery. You could do all of these different things. So we need to kind of come up with a way to shift people out of what is the status quo. And that's where you get kind of more sophisticated attempts at kind of, communication strategy, media management, propaganda, you would probably call it as well. It's very much that. It's kind of hearts and minds, but in a way that's kind of targeted at the key audiences that you think you need to influence in order to actually make change happen.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, as you were speaking, it sort of made me think of I think it was the Malcolm X sort of thing where he was like, well, to give a moral argument to your opponent assumes your opponent has a consciousness. Um, and unfortunately, it's
Yeah.
sort of like, well, they might not necessarily have the consciousness or what they get out of slavery, or they already don't see them as people, so it precludes an argument from even happening. Like, what are you talking about on grounds of sort of Christian humanitarianism that these so-called quote unquote people, et cetera, this sort of vile vitriol
Yeah.
language and whatnot. So that sort of thing, it unfortunately seems like it precludes an argument in many instances, especially in the more intense areas of slave holdings.
Yeah, but I think one of the interesting things about the 1780s is you do see this kind of sense of a debate emerging. You get the kind of a lot of the kind of the Quaker based either publications or campaigning, but also the stuff that they're sort of sponsoring as well and kind of trying to promote as well, whether that might be the narratives of kind of enslaved and formerly enslaved people that they're kind of publishing and promoting through their societies and their resources, or also the kind of the creation of society, activist societies, political associations that are kind of emerging. And then you have this kind of pushback that you're getting from the kind of the apologists for slavery. So you get, I think I mentioned in the paper, there's a guy called Gordon Turnbull, who is kind of associated with the planters in Grenada, in West Indies. You get another man called James Tobin, who is owns a plantation in Nevis in the West Indies. And they're kind of publishing these these pamphlets in response, and they're basically accusing um, the kind of the anti-slavery activists of lies, deception campaigns, disinformation, the idea that you are, and it's particularly effective, I think. Well, not necessarily effective, but it's seems like it'd be more persuasive in Britain, where most of the people who are reading these pamphlets have never actually seen a plantation. They've probably never even met an enslaved person or seen them. So it's very much kind of, his word against somebody else's. But they're very much saying, these sorts of campaigns that are, being done by the abolitionists are completely designed to deceive you. Like, enslaved laborers on plantations in the West Indies actually have a pretty great life. In some ways, they have a better life than the equivalent kind of workers in Britain, where they're not housed, clothed, fed, all of these types of things. And you see that you get this sort of emergence of a kind of what starts off as a sort of apology for slavery, where you're kind of, relying on biblical verse that supposedly says that, it's absolutely fine to enslave fellow humans, all the way through to what then becomes a much more kind of emboldened pro-slavery discourse in the kind of the 19th century as well. The idea that not only is slavery acceptable, there's actually a superior system, economic and social and political system, than anything you'll find in Britain or in the northern states. And partly that is all being stirred up by, for the first time, you have activists kind of calling into question whether, enslavement is something that human beings should be doing to other ones, or whether the slave trade is something that should be permitted.
Yeah, and a lot of times if you have to write something like that, it means something's already wrong. If you need to sort of defend this immoral position with such fierce exaggeration, it means like you're already kind of maybe losing part of the battlefield, so to speak. So I guess in that regard, would you mind talking about? I guess there's two sort of things that happen. It seems like something that really changes public opinion is the Zong massacre. Um, and also, I was wondering if you would talk about that and a little bit of also about the sort of agency, the role that like enslaved peoples played within this, or formerly enslaved, or like maroon communities played within this sort of realm.
Sure. So the Zong massacre happens in 1781. It's kind of one of the most notorious incidents to happen involved with the kind of the slave trade, which is certainly saying something. It's a ship that is traveling to America, across the Middle Passage. I think estimates suggest it's probably got double the number of I guess slaves, slave chapel that it was kind of built for. So massively overloaded, um, take a wrong turn, basically start running out of water, running out of resources. The response that is done by the ship's captain and the crew is to essentially dump somewhere around 130 enslaved people over the side of the ship, and obviously they drown. These people, the enslaved people on there, are insured by the company that had chartered the ship, so from their perspective they will be able to claim that back. What really triggers kind of I guess public awareness of this incident is a kind of a court case that happens in 1783, so kind of a couple of years later. And amazingly enough, it's not the kind of the ship captain being tried for murder, or the crew. It is the business that insured the enslaved people trying to fight for their payout. But in so doing, this also creates a sort of a set piece that can be exploited by the anti-slavery activists, who will do as much as they can to raise awareness. This is a horrendous example that really brings to life a lot of what they've been saying around the inhumanity and the kind of horrendous conditions and the sort of, murderous activity that is happening and that is entwined with slavery. So you have activists like kind of Granville Sharp, who is a British kind of, born into a kind of a British kind of clerical family, early establishment. He sort of stumbles into anti-slavery in quite an interesting way, quite an unusual way for a British activist, in that he actually encounters an enslaved person at his brother's house, I think in sort of 1765, who has been essentially assaulted by his enslaver. And this kind of triggers all sorts of kind of things within Grammel Sharp. One of which is to kind of get really into the weeds around the kind of the legal side of slavery, but also just kind of looking at into things like the conditions in slave trade. So he's becomes from that moment on a kind of a key part of the story, and someone who works very closely with the Quakers in the 1780s in various different ways. But he himself tries to organize a kind of private prosecution of the people responsible for kind of the Zong massacre. He actually fails in that. But in so doing, he's also working with other activists who are kind of in Britain at that time. So the most famous of which is kind of black formerly enslaved labor called Oluda Equiano. And they are kind of doing everything they can to try and raise public awareness of this. So they are, they're producing pamphlets, they're producing content for newspapers, and they're trying to, they're lobbying politicians. They're basically trying to take advantage of this horrendous incident to try and really shift public perceptions about what slavery is actually like, and what those who are going through the Middle Passage are actually facing.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. There's another connection when people think about sort of Quakers, enslaved, slavery, abolition. Um, and that's sort of generally speaking like the educational institutions and initiatives that were tried to set up in numerous different times. And also there's a large interesting role that like Jubilee singers and stuff play within this sort of realm and whatnot. But I was wondering if you could say a little bit about just also there was this general project that the Quakers were interested in. Uh, Abolition was central to it, but within sort of abolition also came like thinking about what education and friendship and solidarity and things like this would look like. So, if you wouldn't mind touching on some of that material, that'd be helpful.
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of it will kind of come back in my answer anyway to kind of Anthony Benazet, and the idea that this is, as people like him are sort of throwing themselves into kind of anti-slavery, they're also looking at kind of, I say, education, but also kind of challenging kind of racial assumptions that are kind of very much there as well. So Benazet, on an individual level, he opens a kind of a school for kind of free African Americans in Philadelphia. He is encouraging institutions to admit kind of black male and female students. He's kind of an educator and an anti-slavery activist as well, and I think a lot of what's happening with in Britain as well, particularly with the kind of the narratives that are being produced by kind of formerly enslaved people, is kind of really challenging the perception that these are, as to your point earlier, that the idea that these are kind of these are non-humans, these are not people like us, they're something different. You know, therefore it is acceptable to treat them in ways that we would never possibly want to be treated ourselves. So it's challenging that idea. It's showcasing kind of the fact that if you provide schools and educational facilities to people from these backgrounds, they are just as capable of thriving as anybody else. And likewise with the slave narratives, you're getting the sense of that these are extraordinary people, that they're not people that should be kept in these sort of subhuman conditions. And this kind of, again, this is something that's pushed back on very heavily by kind of slavery apologists or by pro-slavery propagandists, as well as the idea that um, these are kind of standard cases. There are, for example, I've read a little bit about Frederick Douglass, who kind of comes actually tours Britain 3 times in the kind of the 19th century, and you're getting these sorts of kind of smear campaigns that are happening to say, he was never an enslaved activist at all. He's a stooge. He's an actor. All of those scars that he's showing on his back when he's kind of giving a presentation and showing the manacles that he was tied up with. This is all fake. This is all a bit like now you kind of get these ideas of kind of crisis actors who are being kind of called out on by right-wing sources for kind of these people aren't real at all, and that's very much challenging the idea that the types of leading spokespeople who are coming out and telling these stories about what life is actually like on a slave ship or on a plantation shouldn't be believed for various different reasons. And I think that's very much kind of a battle, a kind of proxy battle that's taking place in the 18th and 19th century throughout the kind of those for and against enslavement.
Oh, that's interesting because it's another early version of sort of like thinking about fake news. And this is the idea of sort of disinformation now happening from reactionary sources, right? So, because we've mostly talked about or thought about kind of disinformation as well within your piece. I guess we could get into what you mean by disinformation and the productive use of it, but this seems to be a negative use of it. So I guess towards that regard, would you mind saying something about the various strategies employed? So specifically, there's two that that I picked out of the piece, and it seems like strategic deception was used several times throughout, depending on whether it was like publicizing anonymously or putting someone else's face in front. This sort of stuff that you get into, and also protective pragmatism as well. So these seem
Mm.
to be two complementary things that you discuss as manifestations of swaying public opinion while sort of mediating any, you know, sort of claims as to like these are negative actors destroying the country from within, this sort of thing.
Yeah, and it's interesting, I think, because one of the ways I kind of approached this project was to think about, well, are there any occasions where the sorts of kind of tactics of kind of whether we call it information warfare or strategic deception or kind of even disinformation are justified? Whether there are some examples where the ends justify the means, and it seemed to me when I was sort of starting out on this that the abolition of slavery and the slave trade would would be as close to a kind of a cause as you'd think now that would kind of justify. The idea of strategic deception, I think the term actually is taken from a really interesting paper published in 2010 by a scholar called Kirsten Sword, who looks at some of this kind of early slavery, early Quaker activism, and sort of traces this strand of kind of deception across the kind of transatlantic anti-slavery that's happening in the sort of 1770s and 80s. And so she points to a few examples, for example, where might be that American Quakers are exaggerating the sort of success and support that they've generated in order to cajole their kind of British equivalents into action. So what I do is kind of try and build on that through the sort of 1780s by looking at various different sort of subtle techniques that kind of Quakers were doing to give their campaigns the best chance of resonating with their kind of particular audience. So, for the reasons we talked about already, there were various different indicators that Quakers would not be the right people or the most effective communicators for this particular campaign. So how can you position others to the front who are more likely to resonate? So whether that's kind of revolutionary heroes like kind of Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, or in Britain, it's kind of establishment figures, it's evangelicals, it's parliamentarians. Remember, this is a time where Quakers aren't even allowed to be MPs. The likes of kind of William Wilberforce, Granville Sharp, Thomas Clarkson, who kind of comes along, and this was 1780s, is also hugely important. So the way that you can kind of maneuver others to the front of their campaign, but also things like, using anonymous publishing, publishing your pamphlets anonymously rather than emblazoning them with the name of a kind of a Quaker institution or a Quaker, adapting your communication style so that it's more fitting with the kind of the mainstream. So, in the case of Quakers, for example, they use a different dating system. So you have, some Quakers who are putting out materials that are already kind of marking themselves out as coming from a strange or a different group because they've got a different dating system. Whereas other Quakers are saying, well, no, let's adapt our language to fit what our audience is kind of looking for, or at least what they're looking for from kind of, elite kind of actors that they think should be running these sort of political campaigns. So there's various different elements you can do it, whether it's in the the propaganda that you're producing that kind of accentuates the level of kind of elite mainstream multi-denominational support that you have, whilst downplaying the kind of the Quaker oddness. So there are a few different ways. I mean, I think whether it sort of strays into disinformation is something that I'm still not quite sure about. I think there are a few times, well, there's a rare occasion where there's like an outright lie that is being told. But most of the time it's much more subtle and sophisticated than that. So I think, one historian, Arthur Silversmith, who's writing in the 60s in the middle of the kind of the Cold War scares around kind of, Reds and front organizations and, communists and all this sort of stuff. He accuses the Quakers of kind of establishing abolition societies in the northern states as kind of front groups, I think he even calls them. But again, that's massively overstates the case. They are still producing materials that disclose the fact that, Quakers are serving on the committee, that a lot of the funding is coming from Quakers, all this stuff. But what they're also doing is they're making sure whenever they put out publications, for example, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, when they put something out, it's got Benjamin Franklin's name emblazoned all over it. It's got traditional dating stuff. So it's emphasizing all the support that they have from people from other denominations. It's a multi-denominational, it's a diverse, it's a popular organization that you should be a part of too, because anti-slavery is now becoming mainstream. So it's the sort of subtle ways that you can do that. And I guess it's sort of slightly deceptive in terms of your audience. It's kind of fake it till you make it, I suppose. If you want to become a popular multi-denominational movement, to some extent, particularly if you're the Quakers, you have to pretend like you are already that in order to make that take off. In terms of the pragmatic element, the kind of the protection, I think is more that if you think about when a lot of these strategies are being used, they're often being used for negative causes. Either that's because they're trying to, sort of deceive a particular audience in order to kind of protect their interests, or you know, to beat an opponent, or to generate profit. A lot of these tactics, deception is typically seen as a negative thing. And I think the point that I try and make in the paper is that Quakers are not doing this for personal aggrandizement or even for political power, although these campaigns are political. They're doing it because they want to promote the cause of anti-slavery, but they don't want it to rebound on them in terms of kind of creating issues for Quakers in terms of like kind of violence, intimidation, the idea that they're sort of challenging the government and the status quo that is sort of still very, very delicate, particularly in America for them. So that is the reason why they're trying to kind of, to some extent, publicly step back from the front line of these sorts of campaigns. It's not that they're necessarily trying to do it for their own kind of profit.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I think a lot of groups now still have to think about mitigating risks and the level at which they're sort of comfortable with doing risks, right? I know like it depends on, the various action. It's like, okay, well, who's willing to get arrested or something? Like these are still very
Mm.
much conversations that happen within these sorts of spaces. But, when I was thinking about strategic deception, the only sort of act of real disinformation was actually like a beautifully dialectical and positive one. Insofar as I read it, and it was like they were just essentially exaggerating how the public support of their cause rather than lying about it. And I thought this was a beautiful poetic device where it's sort of like they are making it happen, right? But they're also digging into people's consciousness in some way and being like, eventually you will be on board with this too. So I thought there was something beautifully hopeful, and I didn't find it to be like disinformation in the sort of traditionalist sense, but I thought it was disinformation in a sort of poetic and kind of rhetorical sense. Is kind of what I was thinking. Like as I read it, because I was like, this isn't different
Yeah.
disinformation as much as it is galvanizing the masses.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a large extent that the people who are being kind of pushed to the forefront of the campaign. So, for example, particularly Granville Sharp in Britain, who becomes the kind of the chairman of the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, which is the kind of the forms in 1787 off the back of the kind of the Quaker sort of under and over the radar campaigns that have been happening before then. And that is the organization that then goes on to, secure hundreds of thousands of members and all these societies, and then eventually is kind of more responsible than any other for the kind of the abolition of the slave trade in Britain in 1807. But Granville Sharp very much knows that he's being used as a kind of a front man. I think, there's some great correspondence between him and his brother where he kind of talks about, well, look, I don't really have time to run this society, but the Quakers have told me that they'll basically do it all for me. They'll write my letters. They'll write my speeches. They'll publish pamphlets on my behalf. They'll even chair the meetings when I'm too busy to turn up. And all they ask in return is that they can use my name and they can use my status. And that's not to say that he's not kind of actively involved. He's passionately anti-slavery. He has been fighting this fight for, decades by this point. But he also, I think he describes it as sort of like very welcome or very clever. These sorts of techniques, he understands that by downplaying the Quakerishness of these sorts of campaigns is actually more likely to resonate with the British public. And similar things are happening in America as well. You've got kind of the likes of Benjamin Franklin and John Jay, who's kind of elected president of the New York Man and Mission Society, who are very much, the figureheads on top. But then if you look at the internal correspondence and the kind of the records, it's Quakers who are serving as the secretaries, who are doing the fundraising, who are managing the books, publishing the minutes, all of this type of stuff. They're very much the kind of the still the engine room, at least in the 1780s. They're the ones who are kind of generating much of the momentum behind this movement. Um, but it's not necessarily them who are getting the credit. And there's this kind of quote that I kind of keep on coming back to. I think it's popularly associated with Harry Truman, but ironically, no one's actually sure quite who it comes from, which is, the idea it's amazing what you can achieve if you don't care who gets the credit. And I think a lot of the kind of the Quaker activism that you're seeing there is kind of is testament to that.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, the anonymous quote thing, there's so many examples as well. Just like one that always gets connected because, I do jazz stuff. One that gets connected with Thelonious Monk a lot is writing about music is like dancing about architecture. And it's either like Frank Zappa or it's like Thelonious Monk. You get the different attributions of it. They might as well just say it's like
This is like
Quaker or something.
this is like in Britain. If you're not sure, just assume it's a Winston Churchill quote. So someone will have attributed every quote pretty much to him at some point.
That's really funny. Um, so I have one question. I have two questions. One is like I want just for clarificatory reasons. The part of the question is why were Quakers restricted from Parliament? If I, I'm not quite sure like what would restrict a Quaker from Parliament, considering that a lot of parliamentarians had sort of religious backgrounds. So it couldn't be like a secular argument. I'm just wondering why that is the case.
Yeah, I mean it's one of a series of various restrictive measures that are still in place in Britain in the 1780s. I think there's restrictions on attending kind of Oxford and Cambridge, serving in the military, as lawyers. I think it's as simple as the fact that they would not swear allegiance to the crown, which I think was that this may be wrong. I need to look back on this, but I think it's a case of if you as you are sworn in as a parliamentarian, you are pledging allegiance, which is something that they weren't prepared to do. And I think again, there's a similar thing that happens in America during the Revolution, where Quakers are being asked to pledge allegiance to the kind of the patriot cause, and they're stubborn. They're saying, "No, we're not going to do that." And they to some extent they could cause themselves, have a much easier life if they did. But as I understand it, the kind of the ongoing restrictions on Quakers serving in Parliament are related to that kind of oath of loyalty that they're not prepared to do.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks so much for that. I was just also kind of wondering, you say this at the beginning of the piece when you're sort of situating your scholarship within broader works. And you mentioned that like the Quakers and their sort of abolitionist work and their kind of like publicly facing work and whatnot has been obfuscated by various other sort of historical narratives of slavery and anti-slavery movements. Could you talk about like the other sort of narratives that exist and the specific ways that Quakers sort of are uh, kind of excluded from those narratives? You lay it out very nicely in the article, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite different in Britain and America. So maybe if I take Britain first, I think um, a lot of the kind of the traditional histories, at least sort of kind of 19th century, 20th century, started off with, I guess, with Thomas Clarkson's own kind of history, is looking at a kind of anti-slavery as a kind of as a political campaign, which it kind of was, but also it was broader than that, and one that therefore would be successful based on political outcomes. So for them, it's very much focused on the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, and then the abolition of slavery in the West Indies in 1833. And these are political outcomes that are generated by political organizations, particularly the sort of the Abolition Society in London that's formed in 1787 that we talked about before. And I think there's a sense that before that point, anti-slavery activism was basically quite naive and futile. There's the idea that, occasionally Quakers would petition Parliament and they get a, respectful, but thanks, but whatever, we're not going to do anything about it. Or they would be kind of quite seen as quite kind of extreme and radical. Again, that's something that could be kind of dismissed. Whereas in 1787, you have the idea that you get the kind of the might of the kind of the evangelical parliamentarian lobby, the likes of kind of William Wilberforce, who are kind of throwing their weight behind anti-slavery. And then that is the thing that kind of over time builds enough momentum to the point where you then get these legislative outcomes. So to some extent, if you start your history in 1787, you could almost negate all of the kind of the Quaker stuff that happens before then. Notwithstanding the fact that the London Abolition Society was built on the foundations of the kind of the Quaker activism that was happening before that. I mean, they even, that society even inherits the money that's left over from the Quaker campaign. So very much kind of continuities. But you could definitely write a history where Quakers are not the focal point. And there's an idea of this kind of great humanitarian narrative of kind of British abolitionism that is kind of to this day probably still like a kind of a national pillar of, we were the nation that abolished the slave trade and abolished slavery, and it was done because of, Christian philanthropy and benevolence and great men like William Wilberforce. And it's quite easy to maybe kind of to minimize a kind of fringe religious sect in that group. There's not for the reasons we talked about, Quakers kind of deliberately kind of downplayed their role from that kind of point onwards. So maybe that's part of it. And again, that's a narrative that has obviously been challenged from various different perspectives over the years. I think particularly talk about kind of Eric Williams and Capitalism and Slavery, 1944, the idea that, there were lots of other reasons why slavery was abolished in the West Indies, and Christian philanthropy does not have the answer to all of that. But that's one element, and that's again moving the discussion on beyond how was slavery abolished through to why was slavery abolished, and Quakers are sort of slightly being sidelined there, partly because of their own actions as well, that they downplayed their own role. I think in America, the story of kind of early anti-slavery activism and the sort of for I guess the kind of the early years of the Republic and kind of pre-revolution is seen as a story of kind of inevitable failure. I think you're looking from the perspective of, well, we know that the southern states are going to entrench enslavement in the United States. We know that they are going to grow bolder. The slave economy is going to be booming, and we know eventually there will be a civil war fought, and only that will kind of end slavery in its kind of current guise. So there's a sense again that they're naive, they're dreamers, they're not effective political campaigners. And there are various different examples, particularly I think the one that I use in the paper is around the kind of a Quaker-led lobbying campaign in 1790 that goes disastrously wrong, to show that, well, Quakers again were relatively ineffective. You could say, yes, there are some successes that are being done, legislative achievements in some of the northern states, but ultimately, the story of kind of anti-slavery in the 18th century in America and in the new United States is one of failure. It's one of failing to stop this kind of slavery juggernaut that takes over. And again, there are other elements of kind of anti-Quaker history or anti-Quaker sentiment in America that is informing the way that that story is being told. Quaker, we shouldn't overestimate it, overstate it. I think, it's nothing like the sort of levels of prejudice that are being, that Black people are facing there, or kind of formerly enslaved activists, for example. But there is still a sense that kind of the contribution of Quakers is kind of being downplayed. And again, you have a civil war that is fought, and that is what ends slavery. It's not the kind of the well-meaning abolitionist societies that are formed in the 1780s.
Yeah, and one particularly stark version of sort of Quakers being undermined in various humanistic ways was it seemed like you talked about how sometimes they were grouped alongside of indigenous enslaved populations as sort of like one and the same, like outside agitators, and for somehow, but that grouping doesn't make any sense to me. Slavery and indigenous people made the conditions of the colony possible. I mean, whether
Yeah, I, yeah, I think it's intended. I think it's intended to be disparaging and to kind of. I think there's a quote from a congressional representative, I think it's William Smith, in sort of 1790, where he sort of says, the southern states the northern states took us with our slaves, and we took you with your Quakers. Again, it's kind of the comparison is that that is how these people should be viewed within the new republic. That the Quakers disgraced themselves during the revolution. They were traitors, they were pro-British, they were loyalists, and essentially they don't really deserve much of a say in what happens in these new United States. And I think that that's part of it. That is, diminishing them. And there are similar. I mean, to some extent there is still there's still sectarianism against Quakers happening in Britain, and there's the odd kind of comment here or there, but basically they're kind of Quakers are much more kind of below the radar by the 1790s, whereas in America there's still an absolute focal point, and the connection between Quakerism and abolitionism is being stoked by those who are, you know, pro-slavery or slavery apologists in order to undermine the cause of anti-slavery, and that's a really important part of kind of making Quakers either kind of withdraw themselves from it or from undermining that whole cause.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's much easier to pin a problem on a group of people rather than an idea, an ideology, or socioeconomic circumstances. Very much so. So I was I was curious, like, I hope this isn't too tangential of a question, but numerous times the ways in which the Quakers decided to stylize themselves and write as Quakers was put into question. You referenced the date several times, like there's a Quaker style of writing the date. Did you come across any other sort of Quaker styles of writing, and what is a Quaker style of writing?
I think the date is the one that stands out because it's, at least on a very basic level, when you're looking at a pamphlet, you know, from the 1780s in an archive, you immediately tell from the front cover, you know, who is behind it based on how that is. I think there are certain kind of stylistic trends that are more associated with kind of with Quakerism. I think there are certain terminology as well. Like, for example, one of the, I think, quite interesting things about the abolition societies that are formed is that they offer that the leading person is the chairman, as opposed to the clerk. So when you have kind of Quaker institutions that are putting out propaganda in the 1780s, they're signed by the clerk of the meeting. Whereas when you get these societies which are trying to normalize themselves, or at least situate themselves more in the mainstream, they are trying to adopt that sort of terminology. So there are a few things like that where you can see what's going on kind of behind the scenes, or at least what you think is going on behind the scenes, which is that they're trying to kind of negate the obvious tells that they are, you know, that the Quakers are running these sorts of organizations, or at least behind this particular thing. I think one of the other things that Quakers do particularly effectively in Britain in the 1780s is they promote the work of non-Quakers. So there's this slave association that is kind of formed very much under the radar in 1783 that are kind of pioneering a lot of these different techniques. And one of the things that they do is they produce these sort of bundles of what they call kind of articles, whereby they're kind of picking like kind of little quotes and gobbets from prominent individuals who have written about slavery, anti-slavery, and they're sending them to newspapers and say, you know, kind of publish these. And it's not quite clear whether they're transacting for those as well, or whether they're just putting them in. But the idea being that you're trying to create an impression that all of these various different people are anti-slavery, and therefore, you know, if you're the reader, you're thinking, well, maybe this is more mainstream than I thought. Maybe it isn't some kind of weird, quirky Quaker fringe cause. Maybe this is something that you know, I should be looking at more myself. So where there are kind of obvious Quaker tells, you're trying to see, but particularly the more kind of savvy activists are trying to downplay those as much as possible and remove them.
Yeah, that's great. And also, I just thought this was such a beautiful sort of attitude to have. One of the prominent Quakers that published an anti-slavery tract found that his work largely was kind of compromised or plagiarized from another person who then published it. And he just thought, well, great, you know, more the merrier. Let's get this message out there. And then had various newspapers publish it in different ways. And I thought that was such a great attitude to have.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, and that again, I think it's kind of speaks volumes to the approach, which is that, you know, the outcome is more important than the credit. So in that case, it's Anthony Benezet, the kind of founding father, really, of kind of Quaker anti-slavery, who is um, basically he's been sort of sending his pamphlets to all sorts of kind of, you know, establishment leaders, politicians in Britain, and he sends it to John Wesley, the kind of founder of the Methodists, who by this point is already an established figure and has got a huge, you know, network of supporters around him. And yeah, Wesley basically takes this and another pamphlet, kind of plagiarizes it essentially, and then produces his own tract against slavery. And yeah, as you say, the obvious thing would be to say, even in an era of, you know, of people taking each other's text and not necessarily having the same attribution codes, to maybe be a little pissed off about it. But instead, it's very much like, no, let me I think I'm pretty sure he sort of finds him a publisher in Philadelphia who'll then promote his work. He's encouraging as much as possible because he knows that ultimately having the Methodists on board behind kind of abolitionist campaigns is going to make a huge deal in terms of accelerating, generating kind of popular opinion, mobilizing numbers for the societies, all of this type of thing. And they kind of the ends justify the means with that. Yeah, it's a really nice example of the way that kind of communications and kind of publishing operates across in a transatlantic context in the kind of the late 18th century, but also the way that you take what you can to try and move the cause forward, which I think is kind of constantly what the Quakers like Ben Azed are thinking.
Yeah, no, that's great. It definitely goes a long way to show like new forms of like creating communal texts and different forms of solidarity, as opposed to like sort of egotistical copyright law or something like this that was coming around around the time. So that's great. I mean, imagine them getting into a dispute rather than just utilizing it for propagandistic purposes. Like totally, completely different story if these were different personalities. Very much so. So you sort of referenced the transatlantic kind of relationship. It wasn't just like British here, America here. It was like there was this communion that happened, and they were looking at sort of what worked and what didn't work, and different figures and stuff. So I was wondering if you would talk a little bit about the transatlantic communication that happened between Quakers and like knowledge that was shared, strategies that was shared, things like this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, I guess on an obvious level, there is the kind of the correspondence that is going back and forth across. I mean, this is a great age of letter writing, where people are kind of engaged in these, conversations that are, taking place over decades. Obviously it's still a period of time where it takes a long time to send and receive letters. So that's definitely a part of it. But also they're sharing kind of other publicity materials. So, it might be, Benazet is sending whole packets of pamphlets over to kind of his Quaker supporters or the kind of Quaker institutions in Britain and telling them to distribute these to members of Parliament or to kind of West Indies merchants who are based in London or whatever it is. So it's kind of quite targeted from that respect. And there's also kind of travel as well. So you're having particularly kind of American anti-slavery activist Quakers who are coming over to London and are very much engaging, particularly with that kind of next generation. Um, in terms of, but also putting pressure on Quaker institutions in Britain and Quaker grandees like David Berkeley to be more proactive on it. So, there's a great letter where John Berkeley is complaining to a kind of a Philadelphia-based kind of grandee, I think John Pemberton, about the conduct of these Americans who are coming over to Britain, and he's sort of saying, they're pushing too hard. They're constantly badgering us to do more, to kind of lobby Parliament and stuff. They just need to like know their place to some extent. So it doesn't always work well, but broadly speaking, there's this kind of amazing knowledge exchange that is happening. And I think one of the interesting things about the kind of when you get towards the end of the 1780s is that the kind of the role of kind of pressure, but also of kind of success, which was previously going from America to Britain, starts kind of reversing to some extent. I think people in America are looking at some of the successes of British Quakers and then the London Abolition Society and actually seeing that as a model that could be applied in America, whether that's in the northern states or in the southern states as well. So yeah, it's not done in, neither campaign is done in isolation. But at the same time, there's no kind of sense that this is a one coordinated effort. Like in an age of, where transport takes, weeks, not months to get across. You're not able to kind of have one centralized body that is coordinating all the propaganda going out or the fundraising or the association. So, but what I think is really interesting is that as much as coordination is possible, you're starting to see that kind of emerging in this period. And that's something that certainly is going to become more of a theme of the 19th century in the way that these sorts of campaigns are starting to operate.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the ships, the idea and the technology of the ships represented sort of both like kind of utter catastrophe and dehumanization and the death of so many things, but also it created the possibility to end those sorts of things as well. So, for instance, I mean, sort of like the kind of middle passage, both like brought and destroyed, but also kind of played a role in resistance insofar as communications go, whether it was like notifying about Haitian Revolution and kind of planning for those sorts of things, or abolitionists kind of discussing materials and items throughout the Caribbean or kind of like European world. So yeah, communication is incredibly interesting and important to think about.
Yeah, and I think that that's something particularly the kind of the 19th century as well that starts to happen when you get this kind of this series of tours that kind of black abolitionists, particularly kind of formerly enslaved people, are coming to Britain to talk to audiences, and they're kind of, people like Frederick Douglass are selling out, venues all over the country. They're kind of giving these amazing speeches, and actually a big part of this is post 1833, once Britain has abolished slavery in the West Indies. I mean, obviously, there's still horrors that are happening out there, and it's complicated. But you have parliamentary legislation saying slavery is abolished. It's paid emancipation. Um, the owners are getting paid, etc. You have the sense that you need to send people like Douglas need to come to Britain to re-galvanize anti-slavery in Britain. There's a sense of inertia that we've kind of done our bit. Why are people still talking about kind of slavery in the South? And you get these tours that are happening where people are kind of like Douglas are bringing to life the kind of the horrors that are still happening in kind of plantations in America, and kind of trying to galvanize this sort of transatlantic anti-slavery again. And I think there's some quotes from Douglas where he just talks about the pressure that could be exerted from Britain on America if you can kind of create again that groundswell of public sort of support for anti-slavery measures, and the idea that this could pressurize people in America. And again, I think the legacy of that partly is that when the Civil War happens, and there are various different elements of a kind of British society, not least the kind of the elites and some of the politicians at the very top, who are seriously considering supporting the Confederacy, and the idea that actually a divided America between the United States and the Confederate States is actually a really good thing for Britain. It's the next contender on the geopolitical scene is going to be weakened. We're going to still do business with the North. We're still going to do business with the South. We're obviously Britain's dependent on the South to some extent for kind of cotton exports, for the whole manufacturing industry. So there are lots of reasons from an economic perspective and even from a political perspective why Britain might actually be all right with the South forming its own kind of slave superstate. And one of the things, at least that I argue, that sort of holds them back from making those final jumps towards potentially, formally recognizing the Confederacy or even supporting them with kind of military or economic aid from a government perspective, is the fact that the British public has been kind of galvanized against slavery for so many decades, from the kind of the 1780s onwards, all the way through to the likes of Douglas kind of coming in the 1840s and 50s. And you have this sense that, when we think about the South in the United States, we think about slavery, and we know what slavery is because of the fact that these, formerly enslaved people have come here and have told their stories and have shown their scars and have, published their narratives, and that is one of the ways that the kind of the narrative has been cemented. And it's kind of hugely important, particularly in terms of, the way that slavery has actually ended in the United States in the 1860s.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much for speaking on that aspect of history that's kind of little known and whatnot. So before we go, is there anything you'd like to say to wrap up the conversation, or any projects you're working on now?
Well, I'm writing up my dissertation as we speak. So this is definitely an element of it. I think this has been a great conversation for me, not just as an enjoyable conversation, but also for revisiting some of the materials that I haven't looked at for a few years and are now kind of forming into the dissertation. So the dissertation itself is very much looking at kind of the broader period from the American Revolution to the American Civil War, and the role of kind of information warfare throughout that period. So things like manipulation of the press, kind of political lobbying, front organizations, disinformation, propaganda, all of these different types of things. And I think one of the themes that kind of comes up again and again through this period and this location is around obviously slavery as one of the big themes, throughout, from the revolution through to the Civil War, but also the kind of the factors that are influencing public opinion. And I think some of these are kind of get into in this paper. So it's things like, the press. This is an age of kind of increased newspaper readership, literacy, pamphlets that are selling many, many, many copies. This is an age of great kind of religiosity as well. It's the kind of the Second Great Awakening. So you've got, the influence of kind of religious figures, the clergy, kind of speaking from the pulpit and influencing the public. And I think that's where Quakers have quite an interesting role to play in terms of the way that, to some extent, they're influential, but to some extent, they're also a liability, which is why, for example, you would have more mainstream religious figures like Anglicans in Britain who are getting that message across. And then also voluntary associations as well. So these kind of organizations that are forming in this period of time, like the abolitionist societies, that are really kind of driving cause-based campaigns into actual political outcomes and kind of making change. And I think this is, in some ways, the kind of this particular period of the Quakers in the 1780s is right at the start of this period where you're creating this playbook for mobilizing public opinion into political action. And it is fascinating to see. And sometimes this playbook is used for positive ends, such as the abolition of the slavery and the slave trade. And other times it's being kind of twisted around so that you can kind of, promote causes that are not positive. For example, the removal of Native Americans from their land, or the defense of slavery in the southern states is also something we've been doing. So yeah, there are obviously quite a lot of parallels with the kind of the information warfare that's happening today that probably wouldn't get into now. But it's it's a topic that isn't going away anytime soon, I think.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I was also thinking part of the disinformation, like, is obviously still with us, but these symbols are too, largely speaking. Like the symbols of this era still have worked their way in interesting ways, like the "Don't Tread on Me" flag, Confederate flag. You could still like go down the street and see a lot of these various historical objects too, as well as specific signposting in certain areas, street names. Like this is still like we live very much within this symbolic sort of sphere that we're discussing. So this was a lot of fun, man. Thank you so much for joining me and for taking
Thank you for having
time
me.
today. I wish you nothing but luck on your dissertation. I'm sure it's going to be a brilliant read. I'm looking forward to seeing it.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you.